Well, welcome to the next episode of the Christ-centered cosmic civilization. And we're recording this just after Christmas, and we are thinking about the liturgical year, the Christian year, which, of course, begins like a month ago from when we're recording with Advent, the concept of the coming of God. And that's how you begin the church year, begin at the thought of the coming of God. And really, the emphasis in Advent is about the second coming, the day of judgment, the day of justice, when everything's put right. And that's a fascinating way to begin, isn't it? To begin from the end, begin from the future. And it's as if, well, that is how the living God runs the universe. Like, he didn't create the universe until he'd planned how he wanted it to end. And he runs the universe from the future, in a way, from the end. And it's the marriage feast of the Lamb that is the anchor point for the whole universe. And it kind of pulls, the universe is pulled towards the future rather than the past and building towards the future. It's the opposite way around. That's how we think of things, really, that like the past dominates and then the present is a kind of outcome of the past, and then the future's the unknown, the uncertain thing. It's almost the opposite way around from the perspective of the living God, where it's the future that's the really certain fixed point. The present is being pulled towards that. The present should be determined by the future, and the Bible's constantly telling us to do that, to set our hearts and minds on the future, and always look towards that which is not yet seen, because that which is currently seen is not as real as the things we cannot yet see, the future, the priority of the future in that sense. And that so in that sense, the second coming of Christ, the marriage feast of the Lamb, those are the priority things, the primal things, the first things, even though they're future. And then the past, so often in the Bible, it's something to walk away from, not to hold on to. So it's a fascinating way of orientating history, and we mention that because the church year begins with saying, do that. Get the future. Let's meditate on the future. And let's meditate on history and how history works and all the prophecies and how they work and the power of prophecies and how they've come true. And so we're being educated and washed, our brains washed in the right way, washed from the depression of a kind of enlightenment view of an upward climb, and rather we're given this refreshing view of a priority of the future. So all that happens for a month, and we have different things to focus on in that period of Advent, and then we hit Christmas, Christmastide, and that's December the 25th in the Western calendar and everything, and we'll keep that Western calendar mainly in our minds right now because it's relevant to all that we're going to be thinking about. And we think there about the birth of Jesus. And of course, it's not the incarnation. The incarnation happened 9 months previously in a day, I think it's called Ladies' Day or something like that. So in a sense, that's something, the incarnation itself happened much earlier, but the birth of Jesus at Christmas, and then you have these 12 days of Christmastide. So some people pack away all the Christmas stuff by the time they get to New Year because they're like, well, that's that, we're done. Whereas, no, if we're serious about working through all the things that need to be thought about and meditated on and enjoyed, there's 12 days of that, and they're punctuated by the circumcision of Jesus on the 8th day, and that works out. So you've got New Year's Day. So you've got 7 days, and then you've got the New Year's Day, and that's the feast of the circumcision of Jesus on the 8th day. And there's a lot to think about on that. And then on like 12th day, you've got Epiphany, where the Magi roll up. And Jesus then is like 12 days old by the time the Magi arrive. They're a little bit late, perhaps, although, so, maybe they were there before that, but that's when we think about them. So they're there within 2 weeks, but there's Epiphany. So that's 12 days. Now, like the 12 days of Christmas song that many of us know, you'll probably be like all kinds of variations of the 12 days of Christmas. And that song's good because it's reminding us of how long Christmastide is supposed to last. I remember when we'd kind of packed away all the Christmas stuff. This is years ago. And then going into Liverpool and then going to the Catholic Cathedral there in early January. And it was like January the 5th or something. And then we went in to a service that was happening there, and it was still full-on Christmas. Everything was still full-on Christmas. Christmas tree up, carols going, everything. And it suddenly shocked me to realize, God, yeah, we're not serious about Christmas, and that's the way to do it, the proper way to fully enjoy all the things that are to be meditated on and dealt with throughout the 12 days of Christmas. And the song, The 12 Days of Christmas, there's loads of variations of it around the world, and the different elements of each day are varied, and there's all kinds of discussion about where did the song originate from. I'd heard that it may have originated in Newcastle upon Tyne at a few hundred years ago, but there's all sorts of debate about the origin of it. But some of you will know that there's an idea that incorporated into it is a kind of little summary of the entire Christian faith. A partridge in a pear tree, that's Jesus on the cross, maybe. Some would say a partridge in a pear tree. And the idea of the partridge is a bird that will die to protect its young. And there's Jesus nailed up on the cross being like that. Or 2 turtle doves, the Old and the New Testament. And the notion of these doves, this work of the Spirit in both the Old Testament and the New Testament. Or 3 French hens. Some people think that's the Trinity. I tend to think, let's have it. It's the Trinity, but sometimes it's been thought of as faith, hope, and love. But I don't know. I'm more persuaded by that it's primarily the Trinity. The 4 calling birds is fun, like birds that are announcing, calling, shouting, and then you think, what could? Well, of course, that's got to be the Gospels, hasn't it? Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They're calling out this story of Jesus. And then 5 gold rings is the perhaps my favourite books of the Bible, which is the 5 books of Moses, the Torah, the Pentateuch. 5 gold rings. These are the golden foundation, really. 6 geese are laying is good. Like, think about that. These geese that are being productive and creative and producing the eggs, kind of. So what are the 6 creative things? And then you think, well, it's the 6 days of creation, isn't it? Yeah, that's it. Day 1, heavens and the earth, then the sky and seas, then the land and the plants, then populating those 3 areas. Day 4, populate the heavens and the earth with the sun, moon, and stars. Day 5, populate the sky and the seas with fish and birds. And then day 6, populate the land and the plants with land animals, and then humanity. And in that sense, humanity is associated with the seed-bearing plants, death and resurrection. There's so much going on for us to meditate on that. Day 7, 7 swans are swimming. So again, it's something to do with like this idea of water and flowing water, living water, is this symbol of the Holy Spirit. So it's the 7 things that are swimming in the flow of the Spirit. So it's the 7 gifts of the Spirit, that are listed in, or the 7. It could be because sometimes when you get into what are the gifts and the fruit of the Spirit, and there's different lists of them, so we won't necessarily list them out, but that's the idea there. The 8 maids are milking, and again, this idea of extracting goodness or blessing from the cow, and there's ideas in that. But those are the blessings of the Beatitudes from the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus has these 8 blessings: poor in spirit, mourning, meek, hunger and thirsty for righteousness, merciful, pure in heart, peacemakers, persecution. The 8 blessings there. 9 ladies dancing. Now, these are the fruit of the Spirit. The dancing of that joyful exuberance that comes, the joy of the Spirit. And that joy of the Spirit is shown in the fruit of the Spirit. Like, if you're filled with the Spirit, to dance with the power of the Spirit means you manifested love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. That is the life of the dance of the Spirit, to have all that going on in your life. The 10 lords are leaping. Lords, they sort of have authority to judge and command. So the 10 lords are leaping, of course, the 10 commandments. And again, to be able, those are 10 commandments or 10 promises, 10 that we can live that way when we're filled with the Spirit and following Jesus. 11 pipers piping. Now, what is an exact? Who are 11 people in the Bible who are pipers piping? That's again that idea when we thought about the birds calling, and here the pipers piping, they're blowing, making a great sound, a joyful sound to be heard. Well, the 11 who took it out, it should be 12, wasn't it? But Judas betrayed Jesus, and so they were down to 11. So it's 11 faithful disciples, and we know who they are. Matthias, of course, is the 12th who makes them up, but this is just focusing on those original 11. And then finally, 12 drummers drumming. And the concept of drummers drumming is that kind of the regular beat that gives rhythm and consistency and a pattern to life. And those are the 12 points of doctrine in the Apostles' Creed. And the idea is you just constantly keep that as the drumbeat at the heart of you, the creedal truths. I believe in God the Father Almighty, creator of heaven and earth. I believe in Jesus Christ, his only Son, our Lord. That's 2 of them. And then the 3rd one, conceived by the power of the Holy Spirit, born of the Virgin Mary, and so on. And there's 12 of these things that are the drumbeat of our faith. So we've said a lot about those, but I like that idea, though, that if we were doing the 12 days of Christmas, you could actually meditate on each of those things on each of the days, not to mention day 8 on the circumcision, and day 12 when we get to Epiphany and moving into Epiphany-tide. Now then, all of that we've just said is just kind of limbering us up for a more expanded view of our liturgical year and the concept of time, and measuring it with feasts and festivals. So maybe what we'll do first, because we've got with us the one of the key contributors of the Global Church History Project, we've got PJ with us, and he's written a fabulous book about something called Candlemas down through church history. And it's only recently come out. And Candlemas is kind of a way of keeping Christmas going through to February. And it's really like, so sometimes people pack away all the kind of Christmas, the birth and childhood of Jesus is all packed away even before the end of the year. But really, we should be carrying on with this kind of Christmas kind of celebration stuff through to February, if we're serious, if we're really Christmas-minded people. Now, some people love Christmas and they get decorations out, some of them in November. I know someone who even started in October. Well, if you're that sort of a person, and that's surely a good thing, I suppose, you ought to be keeping it going to February because of this thing called Candlemas. So we've got the 12 days of Christmas that we thought about, taking us up to Epiphany. And then there's a thing called Epiphany-tide. And then that runs into this thing called Candlemas and Candlemas-tide, which is of variable length. So first of all, let's ask PJ to explain to us this movement of what happens in Epiphany-tide, and that leads up to this thing called Candlemas-tide. We'll ask him to just explain what is Epiphany-tide, and then really we need to know what is this Candlemas-tide, and what is to be celebrated and meditated on in this period of time, which is kind of like a month, isn't it? Epiphany-tide and Candlemas-tide. There's like a good month there. What is going on with Epiphany-tide and Candlemas-tide?
Yeah, so the key idea of it is that when you're reading through the gospel stories, what we see in the Gospel of Luke is he keeps the story kind of going for another 40 days until this purification, or what for most people would be this like presentation or ransom of a child. But Luke doesn't mention a ransom, and so we'll think about that.
This is Epiphany.
No, this is at Candlemas. So that's 40 days later, after Christmas, you get Candlemas. So there's this period in between in which the wise men visit and all of this.
So Epiphany-tide is really just thinking about the wise men.
Yeah, but then also this kind of time when it's just like kind of Jesus and Mary kind of together. So there's this, you get this period in the law of Moses where like a lot of the expectations that women would have and everything, they can kind of like avoid it just to focus on her and her child for a period of 40 days, basically.
Right.
And so Mary has this time where she just gets to spend it totally focused on Jesus. But then also because she does that, whenever Christians and then, kind of Jews in the Old Testament looking forward to Jesus being incarnated and us looking back at Jesus being incarnated, if we ever do a churching, because Moses talked about that they kind of aren't in the congregation, or the church is the literal word, isn't it? Ecclesia, that the women will be excluded from the church and then they get churched in when they're ritually purified. And Christians, throughout most of Christian history, women kept doing this ritual or this sacramental of churching. So that does enable women to just really focus for a lot of time on just their baby. And it helps us also engage. So, like, if you were a little baby, you were like that, so everyone in a fully Christian society would kind of go through this because everyone would have been a baby. But then mothers would have this especially, and they'd get to participate in something like Mary did. Mary and Jesus, they get to recreate something of what that life was like. And so in this period, we just think about what that was like when it was just kind of Mary and Jesus together. And then Joseph then is having to help out around maybe more than he usually would have done. And that's some fun traditions around the world will have that like the husband over this period will have to do more house jobs and stuff like that.
So that is like a 40-day period that runs from Christmas, then for 40 days, and that's according to the law, according to the scriptures, there's a 40-day period, which is really defined as this period where the mother, like in the law, there's a mother who is to be confined and relieved from all normal duties and requirements upon her. And she's protected to have time with her newborn child. And in that period, then, it's really always thinking about Mary and Jesus. That's why these laws were given a long time ago. And so in the church year, there is this recognition of this 40-day period where it's Mary with Jesus and then Joseph having to do all the washing up and the meal preparation and everything. And it's a time, it's kind of like an intimate time of the Holy Family. Is that right, really? Epiphany tide.
Yeah, and so in a lot of stories about the three wise men, they do focus on like Joseph trying to control all these crowds coming in to see Jesus, because he's like, it's important they're all coming to fulfill some prophecies, but there's also, as we thought about, the requirements of the law, which is that Mary and Jesus need this time off together. So there's quite a lot of stories about Joseph then trying to say, all right, we've got to make sure it's not becoming like a burden or like a duty for like Mary, that she's still got this basically time off that's required of the law.
And that notion of time, a protected time for a mother and a newborn, and then there's a time where she is reintroduced into church life, all that's in the law, and the time of the cleansing at the end of that time, that's in the law of Moses. And as you rightly say, that was part of Christian tradition right the way up. It still is in the Book of Common Prayer, the churching of women, the thanksgiving of woman after childbirth. And I know mums who had this service, who wanted this service as a recognition of this period of time. And it's really a time of thanksgiving for coming through the period of pregnancy and the deliverance of the baby. And there's powerful prayers in it. It's well worth looking at if you've got a Book of Common Prayer, and have a look at that. And it's full of scriptures all bound together to do with this idea of coming through this testing time of childbirth, and asking for the Lord's presence, and how she, the mother, puts her trust in the Lord, and so on. It's a powerful little service, and it's a way of acknowledging birth and those initial weeks afterwards. Now, some people don't like that kind of thing, because they go, all that stuff in the law is kind of not spiritual. So there is a kind of Gnostic Christianity that regards anything to do with our physical life, our eating, drinking, children, anything to do with our real human life. They go, no, that's not spiritual. Nothing, like, we shouldn't actually have anything to do with being physical creatures. Like, church is the opposite of that. And so for them, their aspiration is to, even though the church building they meet in is entirely physical, because you can't meet in a non-physical way, but they kind of believe, like, if we have a room that is as bare and stark as possible, and we refuse to acknowledge anything to do with the passage of time or anything to do with physical life or human life, and try to abstract ourselves to mental things only, that is more spiritual. Now, that, of course, there's a long tradition of that in paganism, pagan Gnostic thought and Plato, of course, was like, let's get away from physical things and let's just try to only have mental things. And again, you're like, even our mental things are kind of physical products of our brains, but nevertheless, there's that long pagan tradition, and it has seeped into a whole form of Christianity that kind of tries to say, we don't want anything physical, we don't want anything visible, we don't want to eat anything, we don't want to drink anything, and all that, nothing. Church should be just purely mental and only thinking, as if that isn't anything to do with physical, all of that. So we kind of think, oh, that's bad, isn't it? And it's better that it was much healthier when our Christian ancestors were much more holistic and much more aware of the whole of the Bible, Old Testament and New Testament.
And there was a very interesting kind of feature in medieval life where, for each of these kind of sacrament things, so there was this idea that these sacraments were meant to be kind of these like timeless and like kind of based in a historical moment and everything. But then there was also what they called like sacramentals, which were like all about the present. And there was a very interesting bit of art this one person found, where there were two depictions of the presentation of Christ when Jesus is taken into the temple and Mary is churched. One of them was for Candlemas, and it showed Jesus and it showed Simeon in like very Jewish outfit and very historical, and that was like Candlemas. Then there's another one for churching, which is the same thing, but it's all in what was then modern clothes. So he's got medieval stuff on, and he looks like, because this was Scandinavian, so then he looks like a Nord rather than very Jewish and all of this. And so there was this idea that churching is like taking these kind of ideas and everything we can think about. So it's good to think about ideas, but then it's like applying it and saying, look, here is a moment that is like Mary and Jesus, and we've got to bring, that perspective in and make it real and personal. And so for a lot of like medieval, particularly Catholic, but I think in other denominations as well, like, there was a sense in which women were like priests over these sacramental things. So they often had charge over relics. And there's stories of like people trying to reach relics of like Saint Ursula. And then if a man tried to like take charge of it, he would be like obliterated, because it's like, no, this is what women are in charge of like the kind of the present and the immediate and like making it kind of practical and everything. And medievals often had an idea that like men could like get away with their thoughts and then kind of lose touch with the reality of like pontificating a bit too much. And then like women would be much better at saying, all right, here's how it's actually kind of useful. So whether or not we buy into that in the modern day, it's interesting that they notice these kind of things where there's this idea, like sometimes...
There's the historical story, and that's like... this is what actually happened long ago in a different culture at a different time, and they can recognize, all right, that's the historical origin and something to meditate about the original happening. But how are we going to experience that kind of theological truth or that spiritual reality now? And then that way you take that incident and it has an expression in church life now. I like that. So there's Simeon. Here's what he might have actually looked like and what may have actually happened at the time. But now let's have Simeon as if he's part of our church today, and we're continuing to have a Simeon encounter with Jesus today.
Yeah. And it was interesting just reading that gender dynamic as well.
Yeah.
Again, whether or not we totally think that's how it should be done today, but then, because when you read it, you see Mary is doing like a priestly sort of thing where she's offering up Jesus as this like presentation, as a sacrifice sort of thing. Whereas in the Old Testament, obviously the priests, the Aaronic priests are all like men, but then all of Israel are called to be a kingdom of priests. And so we see Mary doing this. She's offering up Jesus in this like priestly way. And so all this kind of priestly function she does, but it's all this very immediate thing. It's like there's this person, she's actually got God in her hands in this like very literal way, and not just like a sheaf of grain that represents God or something. It's like he's actually
the real
there
thing,
in the present and in that. So that particular, it does seem that Candlemas and churching brought out those ideas in a lot of kind of artists and things in medieval times.
So Epiphany Tide then is this 40-day period where there's a lot of emphasis on Mary. There's quite a bit about the wise men and what they were up to coming, and their involvement in that period of time, because they're giving stuff for that little family, the Holy Family. And Joseph, he gets a bit of time then in Epiphany Tide, because this is... it's funny, really. I found that there's a lot about Joseph in Christian history and things. And in the Bible, of course, Joseph is I was always shocked because, in Protestantism, the whole kind of infancy of Jesus is run away from, because it's no, Mary and Joseph, Holy Family, let's leave all that stuff, because that belongs to Catholics and stuff. And so there's very little deep meditation. But once you do start to pay attention to all that the Bible has to say, and you've got this Joseph figure, Joseph who goes to Egypt and he has dreams, and then you're like, but there's this other Joseph in the Bible who goes to Egypt and has dreams, and like the Bible's trying to tell us a lot about Joseph, and it's like I can't remember ever hearing a sermon on Joseph. It's very rare, and yet you think there's lots of Bible material. The expectation is that we would regularly preach on him as part of this. So Epiphany time would be a good time to preach on Joseph. But all of that is leading up to Candlemas, and our time's run out for this episode. So do tune into our next episode, and that's when we're going to find out what Candlemas actually is.